car sticker. Paul Shamplina is with us. They don't do car stickers anymore.
They don't.
Radio. Do you remember that we used to drive down the road and there'd be a radio station car sticker?
But I can imagine you with the Capri and the furry dice. That was definitely you driving the mean streets of Kent.
Yeah. Well, do you know what? When I wanted to get into radio, it was amazing that my local radio station, which was called Invicta FM, served Kent.
Yes, I remember it.
It's now one of the heart groups, you know. And of course, when I got a job there eventually, I had about 1,000 of these car stickers. You know, it was no longer the novelty. I'd given it all to the family and neighbours, and
so you were very popular.
Mugs and merchandise all over.
That was one of your chap lines in the pub, was it? Do you want a car sticker?
Would you like an Invicta FM car sticker? Yeah, it was as simple as that. There's always a lot to talk about. I mean, the world of the landlord and property and all. This is your area, Paul, and there's never a dull moment in terms of the headlines. Sometimes not always favourable to landlords. We talked about that quite recently, of course, with new regulations coming in from Labour, but a lot of questions we've got as well. People have already been calling in and texting in. I'll come to those in a second. Just talk us... If I say the word mould, because that's always central, isn't it? Mould, when we're talking about landlords, people go, landlords, they're terrible people, they're the pirates of bricks and mortar, and they've all got mouldy homes. But there is a serious side to this, of course. That, by the way, is an unfair stereotype.
No,
it doesn't reflect
it is, but mould
anywhere near most.
No, mould and condensation is a big problem.
Yep.
A lot of it is down to tenants' lifestyles. A lot of it is about a lack of education.
Yep.
A lot of it is about poor management by self-managed landlords. And letting agents, a whole host of reasons. But there was a recent survey that was conducted by over 700 letting agents.
Yep.
And 42% of the lettings businesses said that they'd had a problem in properties with damp and mould. It is an issue.
Yeah.
And this all comes about from the poor little boy in December 2020 that died, called Awab.
Yes.
There's a little boy that died in Rochdale. And they brought this new law out called Awab's Law.
Because they did attribute his death literally to the living conditions.
And it was a one-bedroom council property in Rochdale.
Yeah.
And it was just heartbreaking in this day and age. That was a social property, and I've always said, and I always will say, that I think that there's more problems in the social housing sector than the private rental sector.
100%, and they're not always subject to the same rules and regulations.
No, they're not. But this law is going to be coming in for the private rental sector, quite rightly.
Yeah.
Under, obviously, last week we talked about the Renters' Rights Bill.
Yeah.
So that's the law that comes in where a landlord within 14 days has to deal with the issues and has to acknowledge the issues with hazards. So yeah, there's issues. There's still issues. I mean, there's actually a really good website called Indoor Air Aware, where actually tenants can go online and see about about what they can do. I mean, simple things where people aren't obviously opening ventilations with regard to windows in small flats, and obviously they're putting the dryers on and they're not ventilating. That causes condensation.
Of course it does.
Yeah.
Of course it does. Will this not affect social housing then?
Well, it is. That law's in social housing. They're now bringing it into the private rental sector. So it's across the board.
And yet it's social housing where many of these problems
are.
And, you know, councils will say, well, yeah, we're the best will in the world. We haven't got enough staff to deal with this. That's usually one
there's staff, but don't forget the buildings are very old.
Yep.
Yeah, they're crumbling. Okay. Councils, if you talk about social housing and councils, their budgets have been cut to the bone. And, of course, the poor people that have to live in those conditions, it's heart-wrenching. And then, of course, you've also got an issue with regard to people that are struggling, obviously, heating or eating. Yeah. And, of course, do they put the heating on?
Question here from Debbie in Leeds, who says, Paul, when all the small landlords finally sell up and big companies own all the rental properties, how will the market be controlled? It's a really good point there, because we know some people are selling up, partly because of regulations which are just too... It's not that they disagree fundamentally with some of it, but it's often quite costly. You've got one business, you've got one property, etc. Capital gains tax lurking around the corners, all of these things. To many, they'll get out the industry. Who's going to hoover up all those homes? There is a suggestion that some of those big companies with portfolios of thousands of homes could be the people that...
Well, I act through my business, Landlord Action, Hamilton Fraser. We act for big corporate landlords. You know, I've got one client that's got over 3,000 properties. I've got another client that's got 5,000 properties.
Wow.
They're big professional landlords. They're scaled up. They've got the systems in place, and they've got the money to deal with it. You know, there is an argument the government want professional landlords. There will always be small landlords. There's 2.74 million landlords out there. We are seeing the 1 to 3 landlords getting out, and as you quite rightly said, we've had the tax and I personally have always said this, that landlords should be incentivised to stay in.
Yeah.
And obviously, you know, I've always said that if you give your tenant a longer term tenancy, you should have a tax break because they want security. Now that's been taken away because, of course, they're now getting rid of fixed term tenancies under the Renters' Right Bills, where they're actually going to be month to month, which I think defeats the object a bit. But you'll be able to work around that. But the reality is, obviously, there is the budget coming up at the end of October. Currently, 24% of capital gains. Top high earners could go up to 40%. We are seeing landlords leave. Yes, there are bigger landlords getting in, but actually I can say there was other landlords still getting in.
True.
And, of course, those properties are also going to first-time buyers and people trading up. But, you know, I think, and I've always said this, I think it's important that the government acknowledge that landlords have a really important role to play. And I think professionalising landlords now more than ever is really important.
Mark in Southampton says, what do the recent rental reforms mean for house and rent prices? Will they increase or reduce it, or is it more complicated than that? It's a good question.
It's a very good question. I mean, you look at the stock that's out there. I mean, you know, if you look at what's happened recently, you know, the rents in London have levelled out a bit, especially in the southeast. They've gone from 5% to about 8.5%, from 8.5%. You've still got 20 tenants vying for one property. What does that mean? They're all fighting over a property. Under the Renters Reform Bill, the Renters' Rights Bill, they're stopping tenants bidding against each other. What will happen is landlords will, instead of a rent being £1,600, they'll stick it up to £1,800. And then they will bid, but they can't put it up over £1,800. I still think it's really, really challenging for landlords, but more importantly, like with all these changes, the biggest losers are tenants, unfortunately, and affordability. And
that seems to be the problem, doesn't it? What about the gaps in rent between north and south? I mean, is that... we know that property prices can differ wildly in terms of where the location is. Obviously, any capital city, same all over the world, is always going to be, there's a premium there for living in a capital. But even that, to many people, is curious. You know, not all parts of the, you know, capital cities are not paved with gold. And some of the poorest, I think there was certainly one borough in East London, up until quite recently, it was one of the poorest boroughs in Europe, for goodness sake. So there's not everybody's rolling in cash just because they live in the capital.
Well, they're not. And, of course, you know, the reality is tenants are paying 30 to 35%, I've said this many times before, of their wages towards rent. And affordability is an issue. I know that the government have said categorically that rent caps are off the table. Landlords will only be able to increase the rents once a year, quite rightly, you know. But the difference between north and south, average-wise, is you're paying 37% more rent in the south than you are in the north. But, of course, I mean, the average rent now, as of August, was £2,381 a month. And that's, you know, and you are looking, I know where I live in northwest London, you know, a one-bedder is now going for £1,800 a month.
£1,800? These are numbers you couldn't have imagined a few years ago.
So really, if you're thinking about it, it's £1,800 a month. Let's say you're living by yourself, right? Reality. £1,800 a month. You've got your council tax, that's shot up. You've got all your utilities, okay, before you even start of everything else. You know, so it's challenging. It really, really is challenging. So there is a difference between north and south. I think that there's still investment opportunities for landlords, and I think people are still getting better and higher yield returns as landlords in the north and the northwest.
Question here from Kate in Kent. Are HMO tenants, that's homes of multiple occupancy, tenants as much at risk of eviction as other renters?
Not necessarily. I mean, just really quickly, so just on the Renters Reform Bill, Renters' Rights Bill, I've been saying Renters Reform Bill for 5 years. So Renters' Rights Bill, it's most probably not going to come in most probably a year's time. But what will happen is, the Section 21 is going to be abolished. So if a landlord wants to sell the property and move back in, or there's antisocial behaviour, or there's rent arrears, I mean, even the rent arrears now has been pushed up. So if there was 2 months rent arrears, you could serve a notice, and it was a 14-day notice. Now they're pushing it up to 3 months and 28 days. So it really has levelled out towards tenants. Really, with regard to house and multiple occupation, generally a lot of problems that you have there is antisocial behaviour, because being a landlord managing a house of multiple occupation is really, really challenging, because you've got lots of strangers living in rooms. you're hoping they all get on with each other.
Yeah.
They have all different work patterns and cultural beliefs and religious beliefs and whatever. You've been getting a lot more mental health as well, and that can be challenging as well. But it's really about the same. It's the same rules and regulations, whether it's single let or.
Got it.
How's one to work?
We are going to take a short pause. Paul Shamplina is with us. Lots more questions for Paul pertaining to that tricky, never out of the headline. These are stories that once upon a time would only sit in the property pages.
Yes,
now they're on the front pages because it's
a reality.
It's a reality. Yeah. Property, whether it's buying it, renting it, whether you're the tenant, the landlord, all that goes with that. We'll take more questions to Paul. Text them in 87222 0344 499 1000. We can relay those questions to Paul Shamplina. Lee in Liverpool says, what rights do landlords still have in regards to removing somebody from their property if they want to sell up, for example? Well, this is really central, isn't it, to what this new landlord bill...
Yeah.
Where, fair to say, fewer rights?
So what will happen is when the new law comes in, I predict maybe a year's time, when it comes in, what will happen is, generally, when you give a tenant a new tenancy, which will be a statutory periodic tenancy, like an assured tenancy, so it will be a month to month, rather than a 6 month, 12 month, 2 years. If the landlord wants to sell the property, they can't do it for within the first year from moving that tenant in. And then once they do want to sell that property, because I think it's only fair if a tenant moves in, they should know that, you know... They've
at least got a year.
They've got a year, and, you know... And that's been a big problem that we're seeing at Landlord Action, where landlords want to get out for all these different reasons. And good tenants are being asked to leave, and they're being served notice, and they've got to try and find somewhere else. And then, of course, the landlord's going to have to prove that they genuinely want to sell the property. So they might have to sign a statutory declaration. Obviously, they have to get valuations. There's going to be a whole procedure, because the reality is some landlords most probably will pretend they want to sell, and they won't sell. So, and of course, you need enforcement. But that's the reality. I think, look, if you are a landlord, when you get into buy-to-let and you want to rent out a property, you want to rent it out long-term, ideally. It all depends, obviously, if you've got it mortgaged, and obviously you've got good mortgage rates. But obviously, a tenant wants to stay in the property as long as possible. I mean, the average term of a tenancy at the moment, Ian, is 3 years, believe it or not. So a tenant is living in a property for 3 years. There is a little bit of a misconception that, you know, they move in. But I have heard stories of tenants being told to leave. I think the problem is a tenant is driven by the property, not by the landlord circumstances.
Of course, and, you know, it's worth dispelling, again, the urban myth that even before this sort of renters bill, and whatever it says, the idea that you can just chuck a tenant out is simply not true.
No, of course it's not. Of course not. I mean, you literally will have to go to court. You have to serve a notice. You have to file the evidence. You have to have a hearing date. You have to get a possession order. You know, what I've been saying, because I've been living it and breathing it, I had a meeting with my staff. I've got 22 staff at Landlord Action, and we're doing all these cases, is the courts are really slow. You know, I've got one case, believe it or not, where a landlord wants to sell the property. They've served a notice, Section 21 notice, to get the property back. We applied for an eviction date in July 2023. We've had a notification that we should get an eviction date for January 2025.
Wow.
We waited 18 months for an eviction date.
18 months. And often during that time, the tenant isn't paying rent.
Often they're not. This stage they are. But can you imagine not getting your rent? Your mortgage rate has gone up. It's, you know, it can cripple landlords.
We've done, and that's the problem, isn't it? Even during that time, you know, a lot of landlords, I know it depends on their own mortgage arrangements of the property, but they often work on the basis that, you know, 2 or 3 months of the year is where their money is. You know, the rest of it goes into the mortgage, the expenses, and all that goes with it.
And you've also lost a lot of properties as well, into the Airbnb and the short stay market as well. That's come out, you know, so you've lose that sector. It's challenging. I think any advice, you know, I am going to start a YouTube channel, believe it or not. I've waited long enough. I'm going to try and write it up. I'm going to do a lot of advisory work for tenants, landlords, letting agents. And I think it's really important. Relationships, communication is really, really important. You know, and we have amazing stories of landlords and tenants that have got great working relationships and respect each other, respect the property.
Which I would imagine is probably the case in most cases.
It's the majority.
You know, the landlord doesn't want to, you know, they want the tenant to be happy because it's in their business interest, and the tenant doesn't want to upset the landlord because it's in no one's interest. So most of the time, it's only these sort of, you know, extreme cases often. You've done TV shows about this where things go terribly wrong. And it seems that the the Labour government, there's a sense, and one here from Anne in Birmingham says, Paul, what is left to come from Labour? Should landlords be worried? And I think that sense that Angela Rayner and co are sort of dining out on this stereotype, and they're legislating based on a complete urban myth, which really doesn't define the average landlord. I
did a talk last week for the National Residential Landlord Association. It was in, where was it? I mean, I'm travelling everywhere, Southampton. Yeah. So I said to her, how many of you are driving Rolls Royces and Bentleys? Because that's the perception. All not one hand, one up, of course. They're just normal people. You know, I think, you know, they've got to, you know, the tenant organisation and tenant groups don't help. The rhetoric has to dampen down. Landlords, tenants need each other. You know, it's 20% of the housing market is rental. You know, it's higher than the social market, which is 16%.
Final one from Fergus in Cornwall, who says, it seems we are moving closer towards a European-style rental model. But would this work in the UK, and who would benefit from that? What is a European-style rental?
Well, I think that's...
Doesn't it differ from country to country?
Yeah, it totally differs country to... I mean, like, in France, for argument's sake, you can't evict a tenant from November to March. You know,
really? Because it's winter.
Because it's winter, and there's also, you know, there has been talk by Labour about hardship. Is there tenant hardship? You can't evict them. Well, where's the line on that? I mean, how do you define what a bad tenant is? There's all different reasons. I think, obviously, you've also got places like Germany and Sweden where there are rent caps, you know, but we've learned that if you bring rent caps in, it stifles investment. Investors pull out, landlords sell out, you know, and that doesn't help. But affordability is a big issue. And I think that the Renters' Rights Bill that have been brought in does level up the playing fields now towards tenants.
There it is. And do you sense an interest rate drop before the end of the year?
Yeah.
I mean, inflation is kind of...
Well, it shot up today, didn't it? Well,
I think it's where it was.
Was it where it was? They expected it to go down.
The Bank of England expected it to go down. And sorry, the predictions were that it would go down. The Bank of England predicted it should by this stage, and it hasn't.
Yeah, I mean, I heard that, depending on today's results, they were going to bring a rate rise down this month. That may not happen now, obviously, because of today's result. I do predict that I think rates will come down. I think they'll come down maybe half a point or maybe 3/4 a point, because obviously that helps. That obviously gives confidence, and actually that helps tenants, of course.
Listen, Paul, great to see you again.
Pleasure.
We will speak again very soon here.